What the hell is this doing in my first class? Not who. What? A white flight attendant with blonde hair and a pressed uniform, more than a decade of owning this cabin, said that to an elderly black woman in her 70s. Gray hair, reading glasses, a paperback resting in her lap. Eleanor Whitaker looked up. "Excuse me?" "Boarding pass. Now." Eleanor handed it over. Victoria Langford held it like it was dirty. "Where'd you get this? Pick it up off the floor at the gate?" "I paid for this seat." "With what, food stamps?" Victoria turned to the cabin. A short, sharp laugh. "Sorry, folks. Sometimes strays wander past the curtain when nobody's watching." 30 passengers sat in dead silence. A flight attendant had just called an elderly black woman a stray, then dragged her out of first class. But she had picked the wrong woman on the wrong flight. What happened next, she never saw coming. Earlier that morning at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International, the airport still carried the scent of floor wax and fresh coffee. Eleanor Whitaker walked through Terminal B at her own pace. In her 70s, a retired schoolteacher with decades of shaping young minds in Atlanta public schools, she moved slowly. Her knees weren't what they used to be, but her back stayed straight and her eyes remained sharp. She wore a simple navy blue dress, clean and dignified, and on her collar sat a small gold brooch shaped like an airplane. She touched it the way people touch things that carry memory. Her husband had given it to her the day their son landed his first job as a baggage handler, fresh out of his teens. She had worn it on every flight since. It wasn't jewelry. It was a promise. But that story comes later. At the gate, she handed her boarding pass to the agent. The young woman scanned it, glanced at the screen, and paused. She read the name, Whitaker. Something shifted in her face for just a second. A small nod, almost like a bow. "Enjoy your flight, Mrs. Whitaker. We're glad to have you with us," Eleanor smiled. "Thank you, baby." Nothing dramatic, just a flicker of recognition that nobody else in line noticed. But it mattered. Near the jet bridge entrance, Victoria Langford leaned against the counter chatting with a ground crew agent, laughing loud enough to fill the gate area whether anyone wanted it or not. She glanced at the boarding screen and said, still laughing, "Full first class today. Let's hope they all actually belong there." "Remember that too." Eleanor boarded, found seat 3A by the window in first class. She tucked her carry-on overhead, settled in, and opened her paperback. In the galley, Simone Bennett, the only black crew member on the flight, saw Eleanor sit down in 3A. She smiled. Small, quiet. The kind of smile one black woman gives another in a room where they're both outnumbered. She said nothing. That silence started here. Then Victoria Langford began her routine. She moved through the cabin like she owned it. A warm smile for 1A. "Welcome aboard, sir." "Champagne for 1." "Sissy, here you go, darling." A hot towel for 2A. Bradley Thornton walked on board. Victoria lit up. "Mr. Thornton, 2C as always. Champagne before takeoff?" Bradley dropped into his seat like a man arriving at his living room. "You know me too well, Victoria." They laughed. Old friends, regulars. The kind of bond that forms between people who see the same cabin as their private club. Then she reached row 3. She looked at Eleanor. Her eyes moved from Eleanor's face to her dress to her carry-on. The smile didn't disappear. It simply stopped reaching her eyes. She didn't say hello. She didn't offer a drink. She moved on to row 4 like row 3 was empty. Eleanor noticed. Of course she noticed. Decades of teaching had taught her to read a room before the room read her. She said nothing. She turned the page. In seat 2C, Bradley Thornton watched the whole thing. He saw Victoria skip her, and he smirked. The kind of smirk that says, "Good." As the cabin settled, laptops open, earbuds in. The quiet hum of people pretending the world outside didn't exist for the next couple of hours. Eleanor was on page 46 of her book. A quiet morning. A good seat. Nothing to prove to anyone. Then a shadow fell across her page. Victoria Langford stood in the aisle with a clipboard pressed against her chest like a shield. That same smile. Tight. Professional. Completely empty. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see your boarding pass again." Eleanor looked up. "Again?" "Routine check." Eleanor glanced around. Nobody else had been asked. Not the man in 1A with his loafers off and his feet on the bulkhead. Not Bradley Thornton in 2C, already on his second champagne. Not the woman in 4B who boarded late and shoved her bag into the wrong bin. Just Eleanor. She pulled the boarding pass from her book, where she'd been using it as a bookmark, and handed it over without a word. Victoria studied it, turned it over, held it up slightly, tilting it toward the overhead light like she was checking a counterfeit bill at a gas station. Then she handed it back. No thank you. No apology for the trouble. She simply returned it the way you hand back something you're not impressed by. "All right," Victoria said, and walked away. Eleanor placed the boarding pass back in her book. Her jaw tightened, just barely. If you weren't looking, you'd miss it. But it was there. The kind of tension that lives in the body of a woman who has spent a lifetime swallowing moments exactly like this one. She turned the page. She kept reading. But she wasn't reading anymore. The narrator had paused. She'd been verified, not welcomed. Verified. There's a difference, and Eleanor Whitaker knew it in the deepest part of her bones. A short while later, Victoria returned. Third time at row 3. This time she wasn't smiling. She held the clipboard again, and this time she carried a printed manifest. "Mrs. Whitaker?" Eleanor closed her book. She didn't look surprised. She looked tired. The kind of tired that isn't about sleep. "Yes? I've just been informed by our system that there's an error with your seat assignment. Seat 3A was double booked, and I'm going to need to reaccommodate you." Reaccommodate. A polished word for a cruel action. "Move the black woman to the back." Eleanor didn't move. "There's no error. I booked this seat several weeks earlier. Confirmation number, receipt, everything." Victoria's smile returned, thinner this time. "Ma'am, I understand this is frustrating, but the system flagged it, and I don't have the authority to override the system." "Then show me. Show me the error on your screen." Victoria's left eye twitched. Barely, but it did. "That's not possible. Passenger data is restricted for security reasons." "Security reasons?" Eleanor repeated it slowly, tasting each word. "I've flown more times than I can count. I've never once heard that showing a seat assignment is a security issue." Victoria's posture stiffened. Her chin lifted a fraction. "Ma'am, I've been with this airline for more than a decade. I think I know our policies better than—" She stopped herself, but the end of that sentence hung in the air like smoke. "Better than you." Everyone heard it. Even the words she didn't say. Eleanor's voice dropped. Calm, controlled. The voice of a woman who had spent decades commanding a classroom without ever raising her tone. "I'd like to speak with your supervisor." Victoria tilted her head. "I am the senior crew member on this flight. There's no one above me in this cabin." "Then I'd like to speak with the captain." "The captain is preparing for departure. He doesn't handle seating disputes." "This isn't a seating dispute. This is you singling me out 3 times since I sat down." The cabin shifted. Not physically, but that invisible change that happens when a room full of strangers suddenly realizes they're witnessing something. Newspapers lowered an inch. Earbuds came out of one ear. Eyes moved sideways. Bradley Thornton leaned over from 2C. He'd been listening the whole time, the way a spectator watches a boxing match, entertained, already picking a side. "Ma'am," he said, loud enough for 3 rows to hear. "Just move. You're holding everyone up. Some of us actually have places to be." Eleanor turned to him. She didn't say a word. She simply looked at him. A look that held decades of parent-teacher conferences, school board meetings, and men exactly like him who talked loud and listened never. Bradley looked away first, but Victoria now had her reinforcements. She straightened up, confidence restored. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time. Please gather your belongings and move to your reassigned seat in economy." "I'm not moving." "Then I'll have to involve the captain." Eleanor folded her hands on her lap. "Then involve him." Victoria walked to the cockpit like a woman delivering a verdict. She knocked twice and disappeared behind the door. Moments later, she returned with Captain Victor Lang. The captain was in his 50s, tall, gray at the temples, the kind of man who looked like he'd been born in a uniform. He walked into first class the way captains do, like every square inch of the aircraft belonged to him. Victoria had briefed him. You could tell by the way his eyes went straight to row 3 before his feet did. She'd framed it already. The words she used, disruptive passenger, refusing to comply, potential security concern, had done their work before Eleanor even opened her mouth. Captain Lang stopped at row 3. He looked down at Eleanor, an elderly black woman with a paperback, a gold brooch, and her hands folded in her lap. He didn't ask her what happened. He didn't ask for her side. He didn't ask to see the so-called system error himself. He turned to Victoria. "What do you need?" 4 words. That's all it took. 4 words that told everyone in that cabin whose version of reality mattered and whose didn't. Victoria said, "I need her moved to the back, Captain." He nodded. Then he turned to Eleanor with the expression of a man checking a box. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to cooperate with my crew." "Captain?" Eleanor's voice was steady. "I have a valid boarding pass. I have a confirmation email. I was in this seat before anyone else boarded. Has anyone actually checked the system?" Captain Lang paused. For a second, maybe 2, something flickered behind his eyes. Doubt. The possibility that he was standing on the wrong side of this. Then it was gone. "Ma'am, my crew has assessed the situation. I need you to comply." Eleanor looked at him for a long time. Not with anger, not with defeat, with something worse. Recognition. She'd seen that face before, 100 times, 1,000. The face of authority, choosing convenience over justice. She stood up slowly. The way a person stands when they want you to feel the weight of what you've just done. She reached up and pulled her carry-on from the overhead bin. She straightened her dress. She touched the gold airplane brooch on her collar, just a brush of her fingertips, like a prayer. Then she walked, row 3, row 4, row 5, past business class, past the curtain, into economy. Row 18, row 22, row 25, row 28, middle seat. Between 2 strangers who wouldn't look at her. 30 passengers watched her make that walk. Not one of them said a word. Not one of them stood up. Not one of them said, "Wait, this isn't right." Bradley Thornton stretched his legs into the empty space where Eleanor had been sitting. He didn't even wait for her to clear the row. In the galley, behind the curtain, Simone Bennett stood with her back against the beverage cart. She'd seen everything, every word, every look, every second of that walk. Her eyes were wet. Her hands were shaking. She did nothing. In seat 2A, Judge Margaret Ellison, in her 60s, a retired judge who had spent a career weighing evidence, set down her crossword puzzle. She watched Eleanor disappear behind the curtain, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't speak either. Not yet. But her eyes said what her mouth wouldn't. Something is very wrong here. In row 28, middle seat, economy, the leather was gone. The legroom was gone. The champagne, the hot towels, the wide armrests, gone. Replaced by a seat so narrow Eleanor's elbows touched both strangers beside her. The man on her left had his headphones in and his eyes closed before she even sat down. The woman on her right was watching a movie on her phone, screen tilted away like privacy was the only thing she owned. Neither of them acknowledged her. Not a nod, not a glance. She was invisible again, the way Victoria Langford had wanted her to be from the start. Eleanor buckled her seatbelt. She placed her paperback on her lap but didn't open it. Her hands rested on top of it, still, steady, the way they always were when she needed to hold herself together. The engine hummed beneath her feet. Outside the window, someone else's window, not hers, the ground crew moved like ants on the tarmac. The world kept going. Nobody had stopped it on her behalf. She stared at the seatback in front of her, and her mind went somewhere it hadn't been in years. A classroom, years earlier. A fifth-grade boy named Darius. A bright kid. Sharp. The kind of student who answered questions before you finished asking them. He'd been placed in the advanced class at the start of the year. Several weeks later, transferred out. Moved to the regular track. The reason on the paperwork: system error in placement. Eleanor had marched into the principal's office the next morning. She fought for weeks, wrote letters, pulled test scores, sat in meetings where men in ties told her the system had made its decision. She didn't stop. She got Darius back into that classroom. She won that fight. Because she was the teacher. She had the power. But here, in row 28, seat B, at cruising altitude, far from anyone who could help, there was no office to march into, no paperwork to pull, no meeting to demand. She was just a passenger, an elderly woman with a paperback and a brooch, and nobody was fighting for her. Several minutes passed. Eleanor pressed the call button. A small chime. The overhead light blinked on. She waited. A minute. 2. 3. A flight attendant appeared. Not Simone. Not Victoria. A woman Eleanor hadn't seen before. Mid-30s. Brunette. Moving fast like she had 6 things to do, and this was number 7. "Can I help you?" "Yes. I'd like to speak with someone about what just happened. I was moved from my seat in first class without cause, and I'd like to file a formal complaint." The flight attendant's face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds. Confusion, recognition, then retreat. She'd heard something. The galley gossip had already spread. She knew exactly who Eleanor was, not her name, her role. The woman from 3A. The problem. I'll pass that along to the senior crew member. And who is that? That would be Miss Langford. Eleanor let that sit. The woman who humiliated her was also the woman who would handle her complaint, the fox guarding the henhouse. She nodded slowly. "Please pass it along." The flight attendant left. She did not come back. 15 minutes later, Eleanor pressed the call button again. Same chime, same overhead light. This time, she waited several minutes before someone came. It was Victoria. She appeared at row 28 like a landlord checking on a tenant who'd complained about the plumbing. Same pressed uniform, same clipboard. But the smile was gone now. In its place, something colder. The face of a woman who'd won and wanted you to know it. Victoria leaned down, close enough that only Eleanor could hear. Her voice was low, controlled, wrapped in a whisper that felt like a fist. "Mrs. Whitaker, I've been very patient with you today. Very patient. But I need you to understand something." She paused, letting the silence do its work. "If you continue to press that button, If you continue to cause disruptions on my aircraft, I will radio ahead and have airport security waiting for you at the gate in Chicago. And trust me, at your age, that is not an experience you want to have." She held Eleanor's gaze for several seconds. Then she straightened up, smoothed her uniform, and walked away without waiting for a response. Eleanor didn't press the call button again. The woman sitting to Eleanor's right paused her movie. She'd heard it. Not every word, but enough. She turned her head slightly, saw Eleanor's hands trembling on the paperback, fingers gripping the cover like it was the only solid thing left in the world. She wanted to ask, "Are you okay? What happened? Can I do something?" She turned back to her screen and pressed play. Another person choosing silence, another seat, another row, another excuse. Back in first class, Victoria returned like a general from a won battle. She didn't announce it. She didn't need to. The way she walked, shoulders back, chin up, that satisfied click in her heels, said everything. Bradley Thornton was watching. He raised his champagne glass an inch off the armrest. Not a toast. Not quite. Just a gesture. The kind of nod one ally gives another across a room they both believe they own. Victoria caught it. She smiled. A real one. The first real smile she'd worn since Eleanor sat down in 3A. They didn't exchange a word. They didn't have to. Some agreements are sealed in silence. In seat 2A, Judge Margaret Ellison had been staring at the same crossword clue for 20 minutes. 7 across. 9 letters. She hadn't filled in a single box since Eleanor walked down the aisle. She flagged down Simone Bennett as she passed with a beverage cart. "Excuse me." Simone stopped. Her hands tightened on the cart handle. "Yes, ma'am?" The woman who was sitting in 3A. Was there actually a system error with her seat? Simone's body went rigid. Everything in her wanted to say no. No error. No double booking. No glitch. Just Victoria Langford looking at a black woman and deciding she didn't belong. Simone knew it. She'd watched the whole thing unfold from behind the galley curtain. She'd seen Victoria's face when Eleanor boarded. That flicker of judgment, quick as a match strike. But Simone was young, only months into this job, student loans stacked to the ceiling, a mother back home counting on that paycheck. And Victoria Langford, senior crew with more than a decade of seniority, friends with half the scheduling department, could end her career with one write-up. Simone swallowed. "I'm sure it was handled appropriately, ma'am." 5 words, each one a small betrayal. Judge Ellison studied her face the way only a retired judge can, reading not what was said, but everything that wasn't. The tight jaw, the eyes that wouldn't hold still, the fingers white-knuckling the cart. "I see," she said quietly. And she did see. Everything. Simone walked away. Judge Ellison watched her go. Then she did something small. So small that nobody noticed. She tore a corner from her crossword page, wrote 3 things on it. 3A. Whitaker. No error. She folded it once and slipped it into her jacket pocket. Decades on the bench, you don't forget how to collect evidence, even when you're pretending to do a crossword. Back in row 28, Eleanor sat very still. She wasn't reading. She wasn't sleeping. She wasn't crying, though the burning behind her eyes had been there since row 5. She was doing what she'd done her whole life when the world pressed down on her with both hands. She was thinking. Then she reached into her handbag slowly. She pulled out her phone, an older model with a cracked screen protector she'd never gotten around to replacing. She didn't open the camera. She didn't open social media. She didn't record a video or draft a furious post. Eleanor Whitaker was from a generation that handled things differently. Quietly, precisely. with the kind of patience that people mistake for weakness right up until the moment it destroys them. She opened her messages. She typed 3 words. She pressed send. Then she put the phone back in her handbag, folded her hands on her lap, and closed her eyes. If you thought she was giving up, you don't know Eleanor Whitaker. Now, here's something you need to know. Something almost nobody on that plane knew. Crestview Airlines had been in the news recently. A profile in Fortune magazine. A feature story about its CEO, a man who'd started as a baggage handler in his early 20s and worked his way to the corner office by his mid-40s. The article called him the most unlikely CEO in American aviation. It talked about his vision, his leadership, his obsession with customer dignity. It mentioned that he was fiercely private about his family, that he kept his personal life completely separate from the company, that almost nobody at Crestview, not the board, not the executives, not the flight crews, had ever met his family. The article did not include a photograph of his mother. Remember that. At Crestview Airlines headquarters, downtown Chicago, on the 32nd floor, glass walls and skyline views. The kind of office where decisions worth millions get made before lunch. A long conference table covered in quarterly reports, revenue projections, route maps. The machinery of an airline that carried millions of passengers a year. Marcus Whitaker sat at the head of that table. In his mid-40s, tall, clean-shaven, a navy suit that fit like it was built on his body. He had the posture of a man who'd earned his chair the hard way, not inherited, not appointed, not handed a thing. Years ago, he was loading suitcases onto conveyor belts in a Crestview uniform 2 sizes too big. Now his signature was on the bottom of every company memo. Across from him, Derek Harlan, Vice President of Operations, Marcus's right hand for years, was walking him through a staffing report. Gate delays in Denver, maintenance backlog in Dallas, crew shortages in. Marcus's phone buzzed. He glanced at it the way you glance at something you're not expecting. A message. 3 words on the screen. His face changed. Not dramatically. Marcus Whitaker wasn't a man who showed his cards. But Derek had sat across from him through labor disputes, federal audits, and near bankruptcy. He knew what Marcus's calm looked like. And this wasn't it. What's wrong? Marcus turned the phone around. Derek read the screen. 3 words. It happened again. Derek's jaw tightened. He didn't need context. He'd heard Marcus talk about this before. Late nights, off the record. The kind of conversations that happen between 2 men who trust each other with things they don't say out loud. His mother, the flights, the looks, the questions, the quiet, grinding humiliation of being a black woman in spaces that still treated her like a trespasser. Which flight? Derek asked. Marcus was already pulling up the system on his laptop. His fingers moved fast. The kind of fast that comes from knowing exactly what you're looking for and being terrified of what you'll find. Flight 812, Atlanta to Chicago. She's on board right now. Has it pushed back? Marcus checked, his eyes locked on one line of data. No, still at the gate. Delayed for... He paused. Ground operations hold. He picked up his desk phone and dialed a number. Someone in operations answered on the second ring. This is Marcus Whitaker. Flight 812, Gate B14, Atlanta. Extend the ground hold. Nobody moves that plane until I get there. He hung up and looked at Derek. Get the car. Minutes later, a black SUV pulled onto the tarmac at Hartsfield-Jackson. Marcus stepped out first. Derek behind him. 2 members of Crestview corporate security, badge lanyards and earpieces, the kind of men who move through airports like they owned the hallways, followed close behind. They crossed the asphalt in silence, past the fuel trucks, past the baggage carts, toward Gate B14, where Flight 812 sat like it was holding its breath. The jet bridge was still connected. The cabin door was still open. Inside, passengers were checking their watches, tapping their armrests, wondering why they hadn't moved yet. The captain had announced a minor ground operations delay. Nobody questioned it. Nobody ever does. Marcus walked the jet bridge like a man walking into a courtroom. His steps were measured. His face was unreadable. But his hands, if you looked closely, were clenched at his sides. Derek matched his pace. He'd seen Marcus angry before. This wasn't anger. This was something deeper. The kind of quiet that comes before a man rearranges a room. They reached the cabin door. Victoria Langford was standing at the entrance, posture perfect, smile ready. The same smile she gave every passenger. Bright, practiced, automatic. She saw a tall man in a tailored suit and did what more than a decade of training told her to do. "Welcome aboard, sir. Can I see your boarding pass?" Marcus looked at her name tag. "Langford, I don't have a boarding pass," he said. "I need to speak with the passenger who was originally seated in 3A. Victoria's smile flickered, a tiny crack, like a fingernail tap on porcelain. "Sir, that seat was reassigned due to a system error. If you're with the gate team, I can—" "There was no system error." The words landed like a hammer on glass. "I accessed the booking system from the ground minutes ago. Seat 3A was purchased several weeks earlier, confirmed, and never flagged. There is no error. There never was." Victoria's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Her clipboard dipped an inch in her hand. The first-class cabin went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence that happens when every person in a room realizes something is about to change, and nobody knows what. Marcus didn't wait for her response. He stepped past her, walked through first class, past row 1, past Bradley Thornton in 2C, who looked up from his phone with mild confusion, past Judge Margaret Ellison in 2A, who set down her crossword and watched with the focus of a woman who'd spent a career reading courtrooms, past the empty seat 3A, past business class, through the curtain, into economy. Row 18, row 22, row 25, row 28. Eleanor Whitaker was sitting in the middle seat, eyes closed, hands folded on her lap. Her paperback tucked into the seat pocket in front of her. She hadn't opened it since the walk. Marcus stopped at her row. The two passengers on either side of her looked up, startled, confused, suddenly aware that the man standing in the aisle was not a regular passenger. Eleanor opened her eyes. She looked at her son. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She didn't gasp or reach for him or collapse into relief. She simply looked at him the way a mother looks at her child when the world has done exactly what she always feared it would. "Hey, baby." Marcus leaned down and kissed her forehead. His voice was soft, meant only for her. "Come on, Mama. Let's get you back to your seat." He took her carry-on from the overhead bin and offered his hand. She took it, not because she needed help, but because sometimes a hand means more than support. It means I'm here. They walked back up the aisle together. Row 28. Row 25. Row 22. Row 18. Through the curtain, past business class, into first class. This time, every single passenger was looking, not at their phones, not at their laptops, not at the window, at her, at him. At the woman they'd watched be dragged to the back of the plane, now walking forward with a man whose presence had turned the cabin inside out. Eleanor sat down in 3A, her seat. Marcus placed her carry-on in the overhead bin and closed it gently. Then he turned around. Victoria Langford was standing 3 rows back. She'd followed them forward from the entrance. Her clipboard was gone. She'd left it somewhere between the galley and row 10. Her hands were empty. Her face was white. Marcus faced her. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every ear in that cabin was already tuned to the frequency of what was about to happen. "My name is Marcus Whitaker." A pause, just long enough for the name to land. "I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Crestview Airlines." Bradley Thornton's champagne glass stopped halfway to his mouth. Judge Ellison's hand went flat on her armrest. Simone Bennett stepped out from behind the galley curtain, one hand over her mouth. "And this woman?" Marcus continued. "The woman you removed from her seat? The woman you called a stray? The woman you threatened with airport security? She is my mother." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. Full of 30 people recalculating every decision they'd made in the last 40 minutes. Every word they didn't say. Every time they looked away. Victoria Langford's lips moved. No sound came out. Her face held the expression of a woman watching the ground open beneath her feet and realizing there was nothing to grab onto. Marcus let the silence hold. He wasn't in a rush. A man who'd spent years climbing from the tarmac to the boardroom understood timing. When to speak, when to wait, and when to let a room drown in its own discomfort. Then he turned to Victoria. "Ms. Langford, I have one question. Was there a system error with seat 3A? Victoria's mouth worked before her voice did. I believed there was a... Yes or no? Yes, I believed. I pulled the booking record from the ground. Seat 3A, purchased several weeks earlier, confirmed. No flags, no double booking, no error. The system was fine, Ms. Langford." He paused. "So I'll ask you again. Why was this passenger removed from her seat?" Victoria's eyes darted sideways, looking for help. The captain, the galley, a wall, anything, nothing came. I was following protocol for... Which protocol? Marcus's voice didn't rise. It got quieter. Worse. "Show me the regulation that says you verify one passenger's boarding pass 3 times. Show me the policy that says you offer every first-class passenger a welcome drink except one. Show me the procedure that authorizes you to compare a paying customer to..." He looked at her, waiting. What was it? He paused. "A stray." Victoria flinched like he'd struck her. Because hearing your own words played back to you in a silent room by the man who signs your paycheck is a kind of violence that doesn't leave bruises but breaks everything underneath. She had no answer. The clipboard was gone. The smile was gone. The more than a decade of seniority, the pressed uniform, the authority she'd worn like armor. None of it could protect her now. She stood in the aisle of her own cabin, stripped of everything except the truth of what she'd done. Derek Harlan stepped forward. He didn't introduce himself with warmth. He introduced himself with paperwork. "Ms. Langford, I'm Derek Harlan, Vice President of Operations. Effective immediately, you are grounded pending a full internal investigation into your conduct on this flight. You will surrender your crew badge and cabin credentials to me before deplaning. This is not a request." Victoria's hand moved to the badge clipped on her chest. She held it for a moment. The way you hold something when you realize it's the last time. Then she unclipped it and handed it to Derek without looking at him. Her hand was shaking. Marcus watched. He didn't enjoy this. You could see it. The weight on his face wasn't satisfaction. It was exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who built a company on the word dignity and just watched one of his own employees shatter it in front of his mother. Then he turned to Captain Lang. The captain had been standing near the cockpit door since Marcus identified himself, arms at his sides, face locked. The posture of a military man waiting for a verdict he already knows is coming. "Captain." "Sir?" "You were called to this cabin to assess a situation. When you arrived, what did you see?" Captain Lang swallowed. An elderly female passenger in a dispute with senior cabin crew. Did you ask that passenger for her version of events? Silence. Captain, did you ask her what happened? No, sir. I deferred to my senior crew member's assessment. You deferred to bias. Marcus's voice was level. No heat. No venom. Just the cold clarity of a fact laid on a table. A captain's job is to command with judgment, not to delegate it. You saw an elderly woman sitting quietly with a book, and you took the word of the person standing over her without a single question. We'll be discussing this further. Captain Lang nodded once. He knew. Marcus turned to face the cabin. 30 passengers, some frozen, some staring, some looking like they wanted the emergency exit to swallow them whole. I owe all of you an apology for the delay, he said, his voice carrying the length of the cabin without effort. But more than that, I owe you the truth about what you witnessed today. What happened to my mother was not a system error. It was not a protocol. It was a failure of character enabled by silence. Every person in this cabin had the opportunity to say something. One of you did not. He paused, then looked at Judge Margaret Ellison. The judge stood slowly, the way a woman stands when she's done being a spectator. She turned to Eleanor, not to Marcus, not to the cabin, to Eleanor. I should have spoken sooner. I watched the whole thing. I knew it was wrong from the first moment she checked your boarding pass, and I sat there. Her voice cracked just once. I'm a retired judge. I spent decades deciding what was fair, and when it mattered, when it was real and it was right in front of me, I chose my comfort. I'm sorry. Eleanor looked at her. A long look. Then she reached out and took the judge's hand. You're speaking now. That counts for something. From behind the galley curtain, Simone Bennett stepped into the aisle. She wasn't hiding anymore. Her face was wet. Her hands were still shaking, but she was standing. Mrs. Whitaker. Her voice broke on the name. I saw everything. From the very first moment. I saw her skip your drink. I saw her check your boarding pass. I saw the whole thing and I didn't say anything. I was scared. I was so scared of losing my job that I let... She couldn't finish. Eleanor looked at her. This young woman, barely older than some of the students she'd taught, trembling in the aisle of an airplane, carrying the weight of a silence she'd never forgive herself for. Fear is real, sweetheart. Eleanor's voice was soft, soft enough that Simone had to lean in to hear it. But next time, and there will be a next time, because that's the world we're still living in, remember this. Your silence is someone else's suffering. Simone nodded. She pressed her lips together. She would remember. For the rest of her career, for the rest of her life, she would remember. Marcus turned to Victoria one final time. She was standing near the exit now. Small. Diminished. A woman who had walked into this cabin believing she owned it, now leaving it with nothing. Ms. Langford. His voice was quiet now, almost gentle, which made it worse. You didn't just remove a passenger from first class. You removed her dignity. And you did it because you looked at her and decided she didn't belong. He paused. That's not a system error. That's a moral one. Victoria said nothing. She turned and walked off the plane. Nobody watched her go. Every eye in the cabin was on Eleanor Whitaker, sitting in seat 3A, where she'd always belonged. Marcus didn't stay on the plane. He kissed his mother's forehead one more time, squeezed her hand, and walked back up the aisle with Derek Harlan and the security team behind him. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The room had already shifted, permanently, irreversibly, and everyone in it knew it. The jet bridge door closed. The cabin door sealed. The captain's voice came over the intercom, steadier now, humbled in a way that 30 passengers could hear but nobody would mention. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared for departure. Flight time to Chicago is approximately a couple of hours. On behalf of the entire crew, "Thank you for your patience." He didn't say what they were patient about. He didn't have to. The plane pushed back. The engines rose. Atlanta shrank beneath them, and Eleanor Whitaker sat in seat 3A, her seat, with her paperback open on her lap and her gold airplane brooch catching the morning light through the window. Beside her, seat 3B was empty. It didn't stay that way for long. Judge Margaret Ellison moved from 2A without asking permission. She sat down next to Eleanor, buckled her seatbelt, and said nothing for the first few minutes. Sometimes presence is the only apology that matters. Then they talked for the rest of the flight about Atlanta, about Chicago, about the judge's years on the bench, the cases that haunted her, the ones she got right, the ones she wasn't sure about Eleanor's classroom, the students who came back to thank her years later, the ones who never did, but she prayed for anyway. By the time the wheels touched down at O'Hare, Judge Ellison had Eleanor's phone number, a standing invitation to Atlanta, and the beginning of a friendship neither of them expected to find at cruising altitude. Bradley Thornton sat in 2C for the entire flight without saying a word. He didn't order another champagne. He didn't stretch his legs. He stared at the seat back in front of him like a man replaying a movie he couldn't turn off. The moment he told an elderly woman to move so he wouldn't be inconvenienced. The moment he stretched into her seat before she'd even cleared the row. When the plane landed, Bradley was the last person to deplane. Everyone else had filed out, carry-ons rolling, conversations resuming, the ordinary rhythm of arrival. But Bradley stopped at row 3. He stood there, looked at the empty seat. His mouth opened like a man searching for a word he hadn't learned yet. Then he closed it, picked up his bag, and walked off the plane. Not everyone changes. That's not a failure of the story. That's the truth of it. At the gate in Chicago, Marcus was waiting. Not with cameras, not with a press team, just him. Standing by the window with 2 coffees, Eleanor walked up the jet bridge at her own pace. She saw her son and shook her head. "Mama can walk by herself, you know." Marcus smiled. "I know. I just wanted to walk with you." He handed her the coffee. She took it. They walked through O'Hare side by side, a woman in her 70s, retired teacher, and the CEO of the airline she'd just flown. Nobody in the terminal looked twice. That was the point. Shortly afterward, Crestview Airlines released an internal report. The investigation into Victoria Langford's conduct on Flight 812 revealed what Marcus already suspected. This wasn't the first time. 2 prior complaints, 2 other passengers, 2 other flights where someone was questioned, doubted, moved, and 2 reports that were filed in the system and never actioned, buried in a database, flagged and forgotten. The system hadn't failed. The system had worked exactly as it was designed, to absorb complaints and protect the uniform. Victoria Langford was terminated. Not suspended. Not reassigned. Not given a quiet exit with a severance package and a non-disclosure agreement. Terminated. With cause. On the record. Captain Victor Lang was required to complete a mandatory command leadership retraining program. Several weeks focused on bias intervention, independent assessment, and the duty of a captain to investigate before he delegates. He accepted it without protest. Simone Bennett requested a transfer to a different crew. She was approved. But before her first new flight, she did something no one asked her to do. She enrolled in the Dignity Standards pilot class. Months later, she wasn't just a flight attendant. She was an internal trainer. The woman who once hid behind a galley curtain now stood in front of new hires and told them the story of Flight 812. Her silence became her lesson. Marcus ordered a full audit of Crestview's complaint handling process. Every buried report, every ignored flag. The audit took several months. The findings were not comfortable, but Marcus published them anyway, because the man who started as a baggage handler believed that an airline's dignity was only as real as its willingness to face its own failures. Marcus wanted to call the program the Eleanor Whitaker Initiative. Eleanor said no. Don't name it after me. Name it after what it's supposed to protect. So he called it the Dignity Standard. It became mandatory for every Crestview employee, flight crew, ground crew, gate agents, executives, every single one, including the CEO. Marcus took the training first. Months later, Victoria Langford was working a customer service desk at a regional airport outside Nashville. No uniform, no badge, no cabin to command. She answered questions about lost luggage and delayed connections, standing on the other side of the counter for the first time in her life. She'd enrolled in a restorative justice program, not because anyone required it, because every night when she closed her eyes, she saw row 28, a middle seat, an elderly woman folding her hands in her lap with the kind of quiet that screams louder than words. She wrote Eleanor a letter, 4 sentences, no excuses, no defense. I was wrong. I saw what I wanted to see instead of who was in front of me. I'm learning to see differently. I hope one day that's enough. Months later, on a different Crestview flight, Atlanta to Dallas, a new flight attendant, fresh out of training, first week on the job, started her pre-flight routine. She moved through first class the way she'd been taught. Warm smile for 1A, champagne for 1C, hot towel for 2A. Then she reached row 3, a black woman, mid-50s, business suit, laptop open. The new attendant hesitated for just a second. The kind of second that decides everything. Behind her, Simone Bennett was standing in the aisle, not hiding behind a galley curtain, not gripping a beverage cart, standing, watching, the Dignity Standard trainer badge clipped to her chest. Their eyes met. Simone didn't say a word. She didn't need to. One look. That was enough. The new attendant turned back to row 3. She smiled. A real smile, not a practiced one. Welcome aboard, ma'am. Can I get you something to drink before we take off? The woman in 3A looked up. A glass of water would be lovely. Thank you. No scene. No drama. No one clapped. That's the whole point. Change doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. And the cabin still hears it. Back in Atlanta, morning light, kitchen table. Eleanor read Victoria's letter. She read it once, then again. Her coffee went cold beside her. She folded the letter, opened the drawer next to the stove. Inside, her husband's old watch, a birthday card from Marcus, a crayon drawing from a student who was probably grown now. She placed the letter beside them. Things worth keeping. Then her fingers found the gold airplane brooch sitting in the corner of the drawer. She picked it up, held it the way she always did, gently, like it was breathing. The same brooch she'd touched on Flight 812 before she stood up from seat 3A. The same one she'd brushed with her fingertips like a prayer before the longest walk of her life. But this time, sitting in her own kitchen, in her own light, in her own peace, she smiled. She placed the brooch back, closed the drawer, and said to no one in particular, "It's a start." Victoria lost everything. Simone found her voice. Judge Ellison found her courage. Bradley Thornton found his silence. And Eleanor Whitaker? She never lost a thing. Because dignity isn't something anyone can take from you, unless you let them.